So I want to present Professor Digby Tartam. He's a psychiatrist and professor from the Existential Research Academy, an influential thinker, researcher, and author. And I think for one, it's a very uplifting symposium when we hear from the most influential existentialist in the world today. So thank you for joining us. And he will speak about part God, part animal, which part of being human gives us meaning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much to Alexander for his talk. I'm afraid I'm going to talk quite a bit about Frankl. I hope I don't put my foot in it terribly. My talk, funnily enough, I've just been reading very carefully his collection of papers called Psychotherapy and Existentialism, and at one point he says, in a sense, he, meaning man, or man in the generic sense of man and woman and child, I guess, remains an animal, and yet he infinitely surpasses his animal properties. So I'm going to be talking about ways in which maybe we don't infinitely surpass our animal properties. Indeed, we might need to respect them more. I'm going to take off, as I say, from Frankl. Yoel knows, even before he invited me, I have a big problem with the concept of meaning of life. So I struggled with coming to this conference. Like other speakers before me, I looked up the Oxford English Dictionary, and their first reference to meaning of life is to Thomas Carlyle, who wrote Sartor Resartus, supposedly a great stylistic manual. And he said, our life is compassed around with necessity, and yet is the meaning of life itself no other than freedom. If you see, there's a picture of him as a young man and then as an older man. It looks to me like he didn't find the freedom he was looking for, and indeed his life is fairly kind of tragic. So, just to start with Frankl, this is Frankl as a younger man, and he also refers to freedom. So he says everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Very much an existential slogan too. But he also said the meaning of life differs from man to man, from day to day, and from hour to hour. What matters, therefore, is not the meaning of life in general, but rather the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. So, in a way, what Frankl's take on the meaning of life was that it's a very personal thing. Indeed, it's a very transient thing, that you might have different meanings at different times. So in that sense, he's different from Carlyle, who said he knew what the meaning of life was generically. Frankl said, no, that's not the case, but on the other hand, there is always a meaning of life, and he said it's like the orientation of iron filings to a magnet. You're pulled along by the meaning of your life. It's a field of tension. This page number is a quote from that book I just referred to. Now, my problem with Frankl's idea is a bit like Blake's idea of there being a great final destination for all of us, a very important tradition in the English Protestant Church, primitive church. Blake actually imagined that might be in London, which is a strange idea, especially given the number of homeless people that there already are, as pointed out by the previous speaker. But this was his idea, that somehow we're all aiming towards this great final destination. Putnam, the children's author, sometimes calls this the guiding star. Now, I have a problem with the idea that the meaning of life is actually kind of clearly defined, that one is moving towards something and that gives one's life meaning. It's a bit like Jonah. You know, Jonah, this is an Islamic image of Jonah taken from the story in the Quran, which of course is originally taken from a 5th century Jewish text. And if you remember, Jonah was told by God to go and convert the Ninevites. He didn't like Nineveh because they'd imprisoned the Jews for quite a period of time. He refused to go. Instead, he wanted to go to Jaffa, which is a nice place, but not where God intended him to go. So God had him thrown, well, a slight complication, but God had him thrown overboard from a ship. A whale, or in this case a big fish, picked him up and cast him off to Nineveh willy-nilly. So God, in this sense, had a clear direction for Jonah's life, and Jonah's difficulties arose because he refused to accept this direction. And so he had to be picked up by a fish and reminded of his role. So how this is portrayed in the Quran is a failure to follow God's ordinance. And in that sense, I think Frankl, for me, betrays his original idea that we have to discover a meaning of life, that there is, in a sense, in his mind, an idea that that's already ordained for us, and we just have to discover what God's purpose or destiny's purpose is for us. As has been pointed out very clearly by the previous speaker, and by other speakers actually today, searching for things doesn't work. Searching for happiness doesn't work. This is the choices. Hercules, a very commonly depicted image. This is from Pinterest, as you can see. It goes right back through to the Renaissance and probably earlier, in which Hercules is enjoined not to follow vice and get instant happiness, but to follow virtue and maybe, I don't know, get something in the end of that. So Frankl actually dismisses not just searching for happiness, but searching for ataraxia and searching for self-actualization. But funnily enough, he says it's still okay to search for meaning. Now, I do think there's a bit of a logical flaw there. If you can't find these other things, why should you find meaning? It's not sort of lying about somewhere. It's a process, as we pointed out before. Actually, I do think we have a problem with nouns in our field. I do feel bombarded with nouns today, including white male, which sort of kind of makes me feel very embarrassed to be here. I thought about swapping with Emmy, but she didn't want to have to run in a parallel session like me, so she stuck to her original slot tomorrow. But somehow I think we go wrong when we reify things. I know I'm probably betraying my intellectual origins in the contempt period when I grew up. Reification was the thing you wanted to avoid as much as possible. So let's say that maybe Frankl in other ways doesn't really think we should search for meaning. What he seems to think, reading between the lines, is we should do the right thing, very much like Aristotle. In case you're wondering what the moth is, it's the eudaimonia moth. I just thought I'd put it in as a kind of remembrance. The person who was really good, I think, on not reifying things was a guy called Roy Schaefer. He was the first Freud Memorial Professor of Psychoanalysis up the road at UCL, although he was American, but he came over briefly for that. And he was a very existential psychoanalyst because he quoted Binswanger and Rollo May. And he pointed out that really we should be using process words, action words, when we're in psychotherapy, and not trying to fix on nouns, because nouns seem to be denying people's agency. We should be telling people, talking in words about how people are aiming for things. But there's another problem about nouns, which brings things into life, and we don't always want that. So this is just a little diversion into a study of PTSD. You know, we brought PTSD into life as a noun. Schaefer wanted to talk about living with experiences that were interpreted as traumatic, but now we've got this word PTSD, and if you've got a word, then you've got a treatment. So this is an example of how the setup for transcranial magnetic stimulation, which a multitude of studies actually has shown are effective for PTSD if you do it over the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. I mean, That's the problem with nouns, isn't it? They get you into trouble. But anyway, that's irrelevance. Frankl rather unhappily quotes Freud. I didn't realise he'd been quite such a pupil of Freud, as Alexander said. And he doesn't like Freud's idea that, who said that the moment a man questions the meaning and value of life, he is sick. Because Frankl actually thought we should be questioning that the whole time. He said that apparently in a letter to Princess Marie Bonaparte. He goes on to say, although Frankl doesn't quote that, since objectively neither has any existence, neither value of life nor meaning. By asking this question, one is merely admitting to a store of unsatisfied libido, memories of a previous talk, to which something else must have happened, a kind of fermentation leading to sadness and depression. So Freud maybe isn't quite as nihilistic as that. Maybe he's saying that this kind of these iron filings that Frankl imagined had to be dragged by a magnet into some kind of pattern, and that was his analogy for meaning of life. Maybe the problem is not to understand the meaning of life, but just to understand why sometimes life feels like just one pile of disorganized iron filings. In other words, the issue maybe is not the meaning of life, but the feeling meaningless in life. Now, there's an interesting book about this, which has reviewed a whole bunch of very historical studies of alienation, anomie, meaninglessness and so on in relation to affect, mood, and one of the points made in this book is that meaningless is a particularly common affect running across all of these experiences, but it's in relation especially to externals. And of course, meaninglessness is a very long-standing idea. Here are some of the possible synonyms, and some of the religious synonyms, including the idea of axidy, which has pretty much died out now, but is portrayed in this Bruegel picture, because at one time the idea of sloth or meaninglessness became a significant religious problem, particularly if you're a hermit and you're cut off from other people. So meaninglessness, if we focus on that rather than meaning of life, that actually has some kind of overlap with some of the ideas that existentialists who are not from the Frankelian school, not logotherapists, particularly interested in, particularly nothingness. Of course, nothingness was in the title of Sartre's most famous work, L'Être et le Néant, which is now, these are first edition covers, when it was published, I think in 1943 by Gallimard. And this is what one of the more mysterious things that Heidegger has said about nothing. You might conclude that actually you can't make anything of that, but in a kind of way that's a sort of existential idea, you know, that there's nothing to be found when you talk about nothing. But that's true, of course, there's nothing to be found when you talk about nothing, because nothing is not something to be talked about. It's an extremely vivid and painful experience of being emptied out, of suddenly coming to a halt, not any longer having an agency, not any longer having an organism which has a direction. So, was Frankl right in saying this was a big problem of the modern age? Now, we've talked a lot about the modern age. I think every modern age imagines it's the worst possible age to live in, plus the best possible age to live in. So we've heard that it's a terrible time, the worst of all times. I don't personally think that, but that's probably because I'm a bit dim or I'm a bit privileged, but I'll leave it to you. But certainly the times that Frankl was living in seem pretty horrific, and probably for most of us don't match up to our experience. Of course, if you're living in the Congo, it's a different matter. And from what Lewis was saying, if you're in a minority group, somehow maybe life is much, much worse than it seems to relatively privileged me. So this is a study by Médecins Sans Frontières of some of the people who got trapped in Greece, some of the migrants who couldn't move on when Greece closed its borders. It's a sample of potentially about 60,000 people, although they chose only 47 people to undertake interviews with. They said that according to the questionnaires they used, 73 to 100% of them, depending on which particular area of Greece these people were trapped in, had an diagnosable anxiety disorder. And they gave one quote from a woman who said, "I am not like before. I have insomnia and I'm hysteric. I overthink. I smoke cigarettes but it doesn't calm me down. I feel that my head wants to explode." Now, is that a different state, a special kind of state that you might call meaninglessness? I think maybe it is. Emmy maybe will talk tomorrow about the work she's done with people who feel trapped as a result of the referendum in the UK and are unable to decide whether to go home or whether to, or where is home in fact. And they also experience sleep disturbances and other experiences like being unable to calm down, being threatened constantly. So is that just an anxiety disorder, or is there something special about that? Frankl argued that this was something special because it was a feeling in the noetic dimension, in the neurological, he sometimes called it, dimension, which other people would call, what Emmy calls Überwelt, other people would call the spiritual dimension. It's a dimension that Heidegger himself kind of was striving at when he wanted to distinguish between ontology and ontogeny. And as Frankl described it, these are things that result from an existential vacuum in which there is unrewarded longing and groping of man for that hierarchically highest value and ultimate meaning to his life. Well, I don't think that, but we can say it's something that's characterized particularly maybe by a sense of meaninglessness. I don't know whether you think that there is something like that. I actually think that perhaps that's what us psychotherapists do most effectively. We perhaps are best when we deal with people who are trying to work through some feeling of meaninglessness or purposelessness. I've tried to prove that, by at least try to do a study of it. I've failed conspicuously to do so, as Rick and Emmy will know. Maybe before I die I'll be able to do it. Maybe that will give me some sort of meaning for living, I don't know. So what's Frankl's logotherapeutic method? Well, it's called paradoxical intention. And he gives this example: a boy arrives late to school and explains that the icy streets were so slippery that every time he took one step forward he slid 2 steps back. The teacher says, "How come you're at school?" And the boy said, "I turned round and started to go home." So this is a kind of joke, and Frankl says a lot of interventions require a joke. We perhaps, those of us who worked in families, might call it reframing, but in another way it's a kind of transcendental step, isn't it? It says, I'll go beyond the manifest content. I'll suddenly put it in a whole different register. So here we find a possibility. There is something new, some new idea, which as existentialists or phenomenologists we might recognize as transcending or transcendence. As I say, Frankl's idea was about logotherapy, so he centered it around the logos, which in John the Baptist, John's Gospel, oh, that's very kind of you, thank you. Water, the water of life. Lovely, thank you. Is God. So there is a sense in which Frankl somehow is saying that there is some kind of purpose that's preordained, but the transcendence isn't really discovering, I don't think, an ideal form of the world that's pre-given. It's something about creating some sort of distance from the world. This is what, of course, every opinion about the world has its ground in the pre-given world. It is from this very ground that I have freed myself through the epoche. I stand above the world, which has now become for me in a quite peculiar sense a phenomenon. Now, perhaps we would all have had some experience, perhaps through meditation, perhaps in nature, where some terrible problem of enmeshment and engagement in the world fades away because we somehow can take this imaginative step and see it reduced to being a part of the world's activity, part of the world's display from which we can somehow bring ourselves out of. That would, for me, that's what the Logos also implies, that idea that I can make this great imaginative leap. And indeed, people who've been interviewed in relation to, for example, injury or harm from other people, sometimes describe their recovery, their forgiveness, as requiring something similar, a kind of transcendence. This is a quote from a paper by Rowe and Hanning called The Psychology of Forgiveness. Well worth a read if you're, sorry, it's a book chapter if you're interested. So I'm going to come on now coming to the end of my talk, but I'm going to introduce just one more wild card, which is the idea of the interbrain. Now, I don't expect you to follow my reasoning, which is set out in this book, or indeed to be convinced by it. I just need to kind of describe a different kind of transcendence. Incidentally, the book reviews a lot of what are called hyperscanning studies. They're the growing thing when you look at how brains interact with each other using functional magnetic resonance machines or other situations. And the idea of the book is that actually, although there is now this conception that the brain works through connections between neuronal groups, and that actually it's more interesting to look at the brain as a connected structure than as a focal structure, I'm arguing that brains are connected too, hence the concept of interbrain. And as we've already heard, there are other kinds of connections. Actually, connection has emerged as one of the issues around meaning several times today. And one of the other kinds of connections is an imaginative. So I can talk to myself. That's something that Roy Baumeister stressed earlier, and I can make a story about another person, and that enables me to make a connection too, sometimes called the theory of mind connection, sometimes in psychotherapy called mentalization. That's different. What I'm arguing about is that that's our mental connection. I'm arguing that our brains are connected too. Now, I probably don't have time to go through this. 10 minutes? Oh, okay. Right. Oh, there we are. I've been speaking very quickly. Perhaps we're all right with you. So this is a study, a hyperscanning study, in which people are playing a game, an ultimatum game, standard stuff in this literature, and they can either see each other. The thing over their eyes is just not to identify them. They're Chinese students, so obviously they're very sensitive about personal privacy. So these two can actually see each other, or they can't in this condition. So there's a face-to-face condition and a face-blocked condition. And they're playing this game. They play, I think, 54 trials of the game, in which they have to work out how much each of them gets of money from. And on their heads, there are these functional near-red imaging detectors. Basically, there's a very strong red light and a detector, and the light is picked up and re-emitted by hemoglobin, and so it's a way of testing blood flow, which is non-invasive, which is cool. So this is the area of the temporal here, and this is an area of the frontal lobe, and basically they showed that in the face-to-face condition, the temporal lobe lights up. There's an increased blood flow, which is always, or generally taken to mean increased neural activity. There are interesting things happening in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the bit, if you remember, which was stimulated in the earlier experiment I mentioned about PTSD. So what can we infer from this? Well, what they inferred is that people got better and better if they could look at each other in trusting. Basically, they stopped assuming the other person was lying, and they made more equitable divisions of the money that one person could shell out to the other. and they assumed that somehow that was related to lighting up the temporoparietal junction, and that is an area that is stimulated by direction of eye gaze and by facial expression. So the implication of my book is that there is this kind of connection which is picked up in these kind of hyperscanning studies of directly between using gaze, using facial expression, using orientation and posture and other things, which stimulates in which one brain reacts to the other brain. Of course, this was first stimulated by mirror neuron studies. People haven't been able to find mirror neurons in human beings. There's a lot of contention about whether they exist, but there probably are some kind of similar functionality. So what does that mean? Well, I think it actually is a way of looking at a fundamental difference in approaches made within the existential literature, in which there are two kinds of connections, two kinds of ways of being that are contrasted. There's the Husserlian way, which I've already mentioned, involves some really complex process of imagination, of reduction, perhaps involving some kind of automatic process, maybe language-based, of cognition, which is somewhat similar to the theory of mind. But then there was a very different kind of conception of existentialism, of connection, made by his first research assistant, Edith Stein, who's seen here on the left. Edith Stein, interestingly, was quite influenced by Max Scheler and worked with him, and I think it was when he went off the rails and got sacked from his job and various other things that she lost contact with him. But I agree with our previous speakers that he actually had a lot of interesting things to say about this way of connecting. So what way of connecting is that? Well, there's the Olympian way of going to the top of some great, idea in which you can look down at the world and say, this is why I'm living, this is what I'm aiming for, this is why I forgive you, a godlike perspective. But there's another perspective which was foreshadowed in that forgiveness paper I showed you, in which you just immerse yourself. This is actually Lake Orta, where Nietzsche took Lou Salome and told her the secret of eternal recurrence. But you can imagine that somehow another way of overcoming some difficulty would be just to slip into Lake Orta and submerge yourself in there. Actually, of course, what you're slipping into isn't Lake Orta, but it's a crowd of people. You're slipping back into humanity, in which you do the opposite of putting yourself on a pedestal. You become absorbed with other people, for good or ill. And this is indeed what Scheler and Edith Stein and Schutz and other people who adopted that approach to existentialism were enjoining. So, last couple of slides. This is from a paper published by Siebrecht van Horen, who is here at the conference and has either given or will be giving a presentation, a very detailed narrative about a particular client who was suffering from meaninglessness. And he starts off before this slide by saying he shared this guy's feeling of despair, and he just couldn't know how to deal with it. And then gradually this guy started to talk about how what life was really for him, and it was being there for his children, even though he didn't think much of them, and being with his wife. And at the end he says, whether I die as a religious person or an atheist, that doesn't matter. What does matter is being a father, being a husband, and being a friend. So he's reconnecting himself, not through a great idea, not as Heidegger might have done by going to his mountain hut and trying to kind of find illumination, but realizing that despite his dislike or conflicts with or inability to get on with his children and his why somehow that kind of connection with them was what life was really about. But it could only happen when he was able to stop his thinking brain from telling him that he shouldn't do it. His thinking brain, his dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, has a very, well, all of ours do, has a very strong inhibitory effect on the temporal lobe, to the extent that actually we can suppress our involuntary responses to other people's facial expressions, linked to empathy, of course. So what happened in the therapy, in this neurological dimension that I think Frankel was right to distinguish, was something about the ability to stop thinking about things and to allow somehow this natural kind of relationship with others to emerge. And that relationship seems to me not this sort of Olympian transcendence, but a transcendence all the same, a transcendence laterally, a transcendence of breadth in which you allow yourself fearlessly to submerge yourself in the life of other people, in a family, in a loving relationship. And although you might have reservations and all that stuff, you don't inhibit your ability to be part of it, to be absorbed by it, to orientate your iron filings around it. So thank you for listening, and I'll just leave you with this thought. Robert Burton, in The Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621, advised his readers to be not solitary. So that's where we're up to even now, I guess. Thank you.